Hi folks. So tech is scary right now. There is a lot of firings that have been going on. There's been a lot of mass layoffs. So Meta laid off 10,000 workers last week. Amazon laid off 10,000 workers this week. Let's talk about what that means for you and your job search as a new engineer. So in order to talk about that, we first need to talk about kind of what's happening. Then we're going to talk about what the three big things I think you need to watch out for are. And then from there, we're going to talk about where I'd be looking for jobs if I were in your shoes as a new developer just starting out right now. So to start off with, what's going on is there's a couple different market trends that are really impacting tech on the very large and very small side of things. Essentially large tech companies, the FANG companies, and at the low level startup, new startup, and even mid-sized startup levels where have been a lot of layoffs. We've seen huge layoffs on the big tech side. There's also been a lot of small startups doing small number layoffs, which don't get as much reporting because there aren't as many people that work there. So you don't hear about that as much, but on LinkedIn, I am starting to see that happen. And there are two big things that are causing these things. So one is interest rates. Interest rates are rising in response to inflation, so the Fed's been bringing those up for a while. It is the kind of economic protocol to do that. It does kind of push us towards a recession. There's some question back and forth on when it should be, but in general, interest rates are up. They're gonna stay up for a little while, and so that has made money more expensive. We usually think of interest rates in context of like a house or a car. It's the same way for a company. That is essentially the rate at which they are paying to borrow the money they're borrowing to grow. And so they have to be able to meet that return. They also have to be able to meet the interest payments on the money they borrowed. And so for a lot of startups, they're gonna have to start cutting costs very quickly because the money they're gonna be borrowing in the future to scale themselves up is gonna cost them a lot more. And it's gonna make it harder for them to get out into the market. It's gonna make it harder for them to turn a profit and a revenue. And so I think first thing to keep in mind here is be really mindful of how a startup's financials look before you take a position with them or even go through a full process with them, because I don't want you to waste your time either. Your time is valuable. In the capacity of the startup space too, I think it's really important to look at the financials of things. So make sure I'll add some tools in the description that allow you to profile different companies. The two big things you want to look for is how much debt are they currently sitting on and what is their revenue. So the debt may be hard to figure out, but the revenue thing is a big thing. Are they generating revenue? If they aren't generating revenue, then they're paying for all their expenses either on investment or on debt, which function not dissimilarly in markets like this. And so we want to make sure that you are evaluating those companies, making sure they actually have the cash flow to pay their bills, because the last thing anybody wants to do is get hired at a small startup and then a month later be back out the door because that startup has realized they need to lay off some large portion of their staff and able to be able to pay their interest payments or the rent on their office or the overhead on their infrastructure. You know, these are things that can happen to small companies. So be really mindful of that as well. I myself, during the initial kind of COVID thing, it wasn't in a tech space, but I was working for a small company as in the range of $5 to $10 million as a manager. And when COVID hit, overnight they laid off every person who worked at the company. And so this can happen. It's a big thing to think about. And when revenue drops or when a company already isn't generating revenue in the first place and interest rates shoot up, we're gonna see a lot of disruptions in the space over the next few months. The second big thing is looking at the FANG side of things, the large tech side of things. And what's happened there is they've essentially gotten out over their skis. The market did very well during COVID for them, and so a lot of them overinvested in technology, overhired, brought in a ton of extra people, and now have realized that their expenses are way too big to pay for what is now a receding and shrinking US economy. That is a really hard thing on a lot of engineers, and honestly, it's tricky because those two areas where a lot of new engineers ended up going was towards something like a large company that has the ability to onboard them, train them, take them through stuff, or into startups where they could essentially go in, be hungry, push really hard, and then get some stuff done and kind of make a name for themselves in that space. Now, that doesn't mean that is the whole picture, because there is a third piece to all these considerations, which is recruiting teams. And recruiting teams have been really heavily impacted by a lot of these layoffs. And so a lot of recruiters are out there right now trying to hit numbers, trying to meet deliverables, trying to make sure they're reaching all those things. Also, a lot of times their compensation is tied to performance in two different ways. One way is it could be for hires, so they might get some kind of commission on somebody they bring in, and that person actually goes through and gets an offer. When they get that offer, the recruiter's paid out a commission. Other recruiters are paid based on leads or some combination of both. And that's really where you have to be careful, because if a recruiter is compensated based on the leads they bring in for a role, then that recruiter is going to be more likely to maybe, I'm not going to say lie to you or be dishonest with you, but just kind of mold the truth in a way that makes you more likely to apply for a job, to pursue the process there, because they may get different levels of compensation based on where you get in that process. And so be really mindful as recruiters reach out right now that not everything we hear at surface level should be taken at face value. Sometimes we do need to be asking hard questions to those people to see what is going on at their companies. I think the last piece that we need to talk about is where to look now, because there is still a ton of jobs in the tech space. I imagine in this year, we will still see a net growth in the total number of jobs that are out there for software developers and software engineers and people generally associated with tech. And the reason for that is there are tons and tons and tons of companies that we don't think about every day as technology companies that have a lot of tech employees. So the two big sectors of that are health tech and fintech right now. So financial tech and health tech, they both have huge profit margins. They have the ability to absorb a lot of costs. In most cases, if they've been around for a while too, their company is also planning for these kinds of recessions and is prepared for these kind of disruptions in the market and isn't necessarily going to have as hard of a time paying their expenses in the meantime. And they may even see, especially in the finance world, I know a lot of these companies see this as a good moment to bring on a lot of talent because there is a ton of good talent out there in the market right now. The other big space is obviously health tech. Health tech has some of the same benefits, and health tech has very, very high revenue and profit margins in general. And there's lots and lots of companies right now that are trying to pivot into kind of technology healthcare companies instead of just being standard healthcare companies. And that also kind of is a good segue into the other huge untapped band of jobs out there for software engineers and software developers, which are companies you may have heard of. They may be large companies, they may be mid-sized companies, but they aren't what we usually think of as technology companies. So like, for instance, for Safe Auto or a Lowe's or a Home Depot or these companies that have huge storefronts, obviously employ development teams, may bring in different groups. I know Kroger is a big one that was hiring when I was going through my boot camp. There can be a lot of jobs at those companies, and they tend to be a little more stable because their revenue path isn't as tied into the stock market. Right now, the stock market is really kind of kicking tech in the teeth, and that is tied in part because of tech has a really big growth mindset. Other sectors of the economy, they intend to grow, but they don't need to grow at the same multiples that tech does in order to retain their valuations in their stock. And so for a lot of those companies, they're going to be bringing on a lot of technologists in the next few months because they're going to want to pivot into more of a hybrid model. Maybe they're trying to cut costs with stores. Maybe they want to cut costs with inventory overhead. You are a great asset for them. And so finding those companies and being able to pitch yourself effectively to them as being able to solve their problems will fill up most of the needs for the tech jobs in the near future. And it's hard because a lot of times when you go out and you look now for the next few months, you're going to see a lot of content that's still out there about big tech and startups and how to get started in the software engineering space. And a lot of that guidance is about to change. And so I'm here just to really encourage you to look at things you wouldn't normally think about as tech companies. Look for companies that have good profit positivity. If you want to get really down into the financial weeds, I'd look at EBITDA, see whose operating costs are low versus their cash flow. You know, you can go way down into it. I'm not a finance guy. I don't know all that stuff. I did a little bit of economics in college, so I know the words, and that's all about as much as I know about it. But I do know that you really want to be careful of any company that isn't turning a profit or a company that has been spending the last few years massively scaling their developer workforce, because they're probably not going to need that many developers in the next few years. And I think there are a ton of places that are still looking for developers that have just been essentially experiencing a hiring drought. I know that's been one big thing at my firm, is that there's been just a huge number of open positions that have gone unfulfilled because there's been such out of whack compensation pay at some of the big tech companies that people are getting drawn into those instead of looking around at other sectors of the economy. And so hopefully this will help you all. The biggest thing I want to communicate is the tech sector is not dead. There are still lots of jobs out there. You just need to look for them in places you wouldn't have normally looked, and maybe let go of some of that guidance around looking for big tech companies to onboard you or tiny startups where you can really hustle and make a name for yourself, because those are the spaces I think that are going to experience the most fluctuation and the most turbulence over the next few months. So hope this helps, and if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I'll see you soon.